Welcome to 2 Rail O-Scale 2016. I'm Terry Terrence and I'm your host for this video. You're about to see several layouts which demonstrate the possibilities available in 2 Rail O-Scale. Along the way we hope to dispel 3 myths. First myth is that you need an aircraft hangar size space to do 2 Rail O-Scale successfully. Not true, as most of the railroads you're going to see are built in very modest sized basements. Myth number 2, that there isn't enough equipment available in 2 Rail O-Scale to do prototype modeling. You'll see modelers modeling the Norfolk and Western, the Pennsylvania, and even the Colorado Midland in the 19th century, and doing it with a high degree of accuracy. Myth number 3 is that 2 Rail O-Scale is expensive. This also is not necessarily true if you're willing to use the readily available 3 rail scale sized and scale detailed equipment and convert it to 2 rail. And one other thing, in the making of this video, we've made no attempt to do only tight shots on the trains to make them look more realistic. We've done this video as though you're a model railroader and rail fan visiting these layouts. So you're going to see bench work, even bare bench work in some cases. So sit back, relax, and watch 2 Rail O-Scale 2016. First up, we have Jim Cantor's portable Proto 48 layout, seen here in video taken at the 2014 National Train Show. Jim's 8-foot by 16-foot layout breaks down into 4 sections and is designed to be set up in any suitable space, like a single-car garage stall, and removed when it's not needed. And it can be transported in the back of a full-size pickup truck equipped with a cab. Designed in the tradition of the 4x8-foot HO starter layout, this O-Scale layout does it one better as it has a central operating opening, allowing it to fill the space right out to the walls and still be run from the inside. There are tracks leading off of 3 corners of the layout to allow for future expansion. All of the track and turnouts on the layout are hand-laid, and the turnouts are generous and realistic-looking number 8s and number 10s. Constructed with P48 components from American Switch and Signal. Equipment is a mix of plastic and brass diesels as well as plastic and brass freight cars, mostly plastic. The rolling stock is all converted from standard O-Scale to Proto 48 by changing the wheel sets and or changing the trucks. It's that simple. City running, country running, and switching are all present. The loop offers continuous running for most 4-axle diesels and compatible steam locos. The industrial areas can be switched clear of the loop. A mainline stub along one side provides an area where longer locos and equipment can stretch their legs, and a 2-track stubbed crossing adds scenic interest. It's not difficult to keep 3 trains running at once on this layout, one on the continuous loop, one shuttling between the 2 industrial areas, and another shuttling back and forth on the mainline stub. Since this video was taken, the layout has been automated via an NCE mini panel to allow for autonomous operation at train shows. Running the trains at realistic speeds, as seen in these videos, makes the layout seem much larger than one would expect. With a switching lead clear of the continuous loop, a lone operator can enjoy making setouts while he watches another train tick off the miles. This is the perfect layout for DCC operation, as there is no need for track blocks and locomotives can operate in close proximity while still remaining independent of one another. Structures in the city are almost exclusively Woodland Scenics built-ups that have been slightly modified and, in some cases, paired to replicate the arrangement commonly found in cities. Miscellaneous other structures like the train station and the gas station round out the look. If the layout is mounted closer to the owner's chest level, the city structures at one end of the layout interrupt the sight line to the train and help dissipate the feeling that the train is chasing its tail. Construction of this layout was fairly rapid, with Jim and his crew reaching the level of completion that you see here in 1 year and 11 days in order to make it to the National Train Show in 2014. Jim's layout demonstrates what can be accomplished in O-scale in a space, even a shared space, that most everyone can find. In a modest-sized basement in Maryland, Chris Smith runs the largest classes of Norfolk and Western articulateds. Chris's layout has to avoid the usual basement obstacles, but he camouflages this with spectacular scenery. Let's listen to Chris's story. Chris, thank you for opening up your layout to us. Can you tell us a little bit about the theme of your layout?
Yes, the name of the layout is Norfolk and Western Fuel Satisfaction, and it's set in the late summer of 1953. The fuel satisfaction part comes from an N&W promotional ad. The layout is inspired by the N&W East-West two-track main line west of Welch, West Virginia, between Yeager and Bluefield, and is all steam action. While the layout is inspired by the region, there's no strict adherence to modeling anything specific from the region. I'm just trying to capture the flavor of the N&W here. Since the yards at Yeager to the west and Bluefield to the east are too large to represent in the space I have, they are considered offstage. Trains traveling from points east and west run to and from the hidden storage and staging level, which serves as Bluefield and Yeager. Inside a tunnel is a switch that directs the trains to the storage and staging level. The basic operating scheme is empties in and loads out. Empty trains are brought by Y6 engines to the yard called farm. The train is then broken into smaller segments. From there, the empties are taken by Y3 to the coal mine, and the loads are taken back to farm yard from the mine. A larger train is built at the yard, and the loads are taken to Yeager or Bluefield. There's a limited amount of local mixed freight switching in the plan, and some east-west mainline passenger train run-bys. While there is operation planned into the layout, for the most part I like to watch the trains as a railfan transported back in time.
Chris, how long has your layout been under construction?
I started construction on the layout in spring of 2003. The basement footprint is about 24 by 26 feet, and the layout fills most of it. It's basically a twice around with a lobe in the middle. The mainline minimum radius is in the lobe at 56 inches and 60 inches. The rest of the mainline minimum radiuses are 60 and 64 inches and above. The layout is a walk-around with one stoop under an Atlas bridge. The height of the lower level hidden storage and staging is at 36 inches. The height of the middle level is at 52 inches, and the upper level is at 60 inches. There are 2 to 3% grades between the levels. The sub-road bed is all CNC routed. I designed the layout using Third Planet software and then took it to a local shop to be routed. The track I used is Atlas Flex Track. For turnouts I use old Pullman kits that were upgraded with right-of-way components. The layout is set up to run on DCC power packs or DCC through toggle switches. I'm using North Coast DCC. Some of the bridges on the layout are Atlas and some are all. The piers on the river scene are scratch built out of wood. The pier for the bridges crossing over the middle level were kit bashed from parts of an Atlas bridge. The concrete tunnel portals are made of plywood, covered in patching plaster, and painted to look like concrete and stained with India ink. The stone tunnel portals and retaining walls are from Scenic Express and were modified to some degree or another. The line poles on the layout were all scratch-built.
You're a pretty orthodox Norfolk and Western modeler, and you have most classes of Norfolk and Western steam on your layout. Exactly how many classes do you have?
I have A's from Precision Scale and Mike's Train House, J's from Overland and Mike's Train House, K2's from Sunset, M's from Sunset, Y3's from Sunset, and a Y3A from Overland, Y6A's and B's from Sunset and Coes, S1A's from Precision Scale, and a Z1A and a Z1B from Precision Scale. I also have a scratch-built M2 and E2 engines by Frank Miller. Class A locomotives were not generally used in the region I'm modeling, but I could not resist having them on the layout. I have one coal train that more resembles something from Blue Ridge. K3 engines were imported by Sunset, but they were off the railroad before 1953. I do have an Overland unstreamlined J1, but they were streamlined soon after World War II.
Chris, you also have scads of Norfolk and Western hoppers, which probably represent several different classes. Which classes are represented on your layout?
I have HLs, H2s, two varieties of H2As including split sides, H3 split sides, H4 steel sides, two varieties of H9s including the split-sided version. I also have some H1s which will be used in maintenance of way service. I have one example of an HU 4-bay hopper, but they were all rebuilt into H3s, long before 1953. I also have an example of an H-10 hopper which came in at about 1957.
Your layout has a special connection to John Armstrong. What is it?
John lived nearby, and when I got into the local O-scale group, I used to travel with him to the weekly get-togethers. I had done some designs for the layout, and one evening I decided to share them with the group. The designs went around the table, and there was dead silence. When the designs got to John, he put them aside and started doodling on a napkin. He handed the napkin to me with a simple route for the trains to follow and said something like, "This is the area you need to work in." The light bulb went off and I studied John's books pretty religiously. I added the second loop, which splits the lobe, but without John's input, I'd have been lost.
Chris, your basement is similar in size to John's, or is it smaller?
My basement is smaller than John's was. With John's layout, you could walk under the steps, which is a great thing to have.
Your layout had the usual basement obstacles to overcome, for instance the washer dryer, the furnace, etc. Scenery on your layout presented a challenge because of the narrow shelves around the walls that resulted from avoiding household infrastructure. Yet your layout scenery is fantastic. Can you say something about your shallow, vertical scenery?
The N&W region I chose to model is perfect for vertical scenery. When I visited the region, it struck me that the mountainsides were steep and the valley the trains ran through made it feel almost claustrophobic. With vertical scenery, the horizon line is never visible. It is always behind the mountainside. In this way, the trees can create a forced perspective to make the mountains look big. The trees at the top of the scenery are very small, and they get larger as they come down to eye level. I use a variety of materials from Scenic Express, including super trees, but the dirt and clay are from my own yard. The river crossing scene was pretty simply constructed. First, the shorelines were built up and rock jutouts were added. Then, in between the shorelines, very wet plaster was poured in and allowed to flow. Once everything dried, the creek was painted a dark Payne's gray color, and the shoreline's colors were blended into the creek. When everything looked as good and creek-like as I could make it, I added some sticks, some small stones, and sand in some areas. Then I poured in layers of polyurethane to make the creek look shiny. One necessary feature on the N&W is the rock slide fences. These were all scratch-built by using rail and woven stainless steel mesh. The center lobe will have a mountain right down the center, which will serve as a natural divider between farmyard and the mine facility. The mine has stub-ended empty storage for 15 to 20 cars. The engine can run around the mine to deliver the empties. The mine itself can hold 14 to 15 hoppers under it, and 14 to 15 more loaded hoppers can be stored on the other side of the mine to be taken back to farm. The mine will be scratch-built and combines features from two mines. One of the mines is a mine in Nuttleburg, West Virginia, along the C&O, which is now restored. And the other mine is the Raven Red Ash No. 2 mine along the N&W in West Virginia.
Chris, thank you for the tour of your layout. In the basement of a tract house in Northern Virginia, John Sethian has modeled the densest, highest traffic part of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Northeast Corridor through New Jersey. John accurately reproduces the look and feel of the Northeast Corridor of the mid-50s without being constrained to reproduce a particular location in detail. John is a convert from 3-rail to 2-rail, and he has an affinity for converting scale-sized and detailed 3-rail equipment to 2-rail as an economical way to get into 2-rail. He provides a rather complete tutorial on the conversion process. John, thank you for this opportunity to view your layout. Can you tell us what your theme is for your layout?
My layout, as I'm fond to say, is inspired by, but not beholden to, the Pennsylvania Railroad through New Jersey in about 1955, 1956. What I mean by that inspired by, but beholden to, is try to get all the scenic elements in place, all the cars and locomotive are typical, but I'm not a slave to any particular building, location, anything like that. I take it as a supreme compliment if somebody comes to my layout room and says, "Wow, that looks like New Jersey." Now, I know that's not a common thought, but anyway, I take it as a compliment. The other thing I'm doing is I'm trying to get what I call signature scenes on the layout that kind of define it. Princeton Junction, the idea of high-speed track going over a small town. Some city that looks like a cross between Trenton, Newark, Wilmington, and Philadelphia. The yards leaving that city. The Whitford Bridge. In addition, I'm also incorporating some scenes from Edward Hopper. He's a great American artist, and I try to incorporate that in the layout. The thing that may be unique about my layout is, first of all, it's double-tracked all the way around, but it is also, there are 4 tracks going through the Princeton Junction section. 4 tracks is what the Northeast Corridor of the Pennsylvania Railroad locomotives had back then in the 50s. That enables me to duplicate high-speed rail traffic, heavy rail traffic, passenger, freight, little local commuter trains. For those of you who know, the primary engine the Pennsylvania Railroad ran back then was the electric GG1. Most all the locomotives on the railroad were powered overhead with catenary wire. Those of you familiar with the Line L version of the GG1 are probably familiar with something that's relatively short, about 12 inches long. But in reality, a scale GG1 is more like 20 inches long. And believe it or not, they're fairly easy to get. They're now available by a large number of manufacturers.
John, what about diesels, steam locomotives? Do you run anything other than electrics?
Yes, I do. Even though most of the locomotives are electric, I have some diesels and I have some steam. The main reason I have them is I like their looks, and if I can justify from historical photographs that they ran on the Northeast Corridor, they've got them.
John, you've spent a lot of time reproducing the look and feel of the Northeast Corridor. Many of the details on your layout are not commercially available in O scale or even in HO for that matter. Yet you found innovative and simple ways to produce the details that you need. Can you mention some of them?
Well, you're right. What makes a layout unique is all the signature details, not just the scenes, but the details. And the Pennsy had some very unique details, as did New Jersey, that kind of defined the area. So I tried to replicate those, and as you point out, unfortunately they're not available, so you have to do it. One of the things I have are the block walls. The Pennsy had these gargantuan 2 feet by 3 feet block walls that they used to hold the railroad up. They used it for arches, for underpasses, and things like that. Well, all I got to say there is that whoever owns Lego, developed the company, must have worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, because it turned out Lego blocks are the ideal size for this. I take Lego blocks, I prime their surface, cover them with joint compound or spackling compound, dye them, and then just stick them all together. And you've seen on the layout that I can get quite a lot of different shapes and a fairly realistic depiction. Another one is the post and guardrail fence. This used to be, long before people considered things like highway safety, the prime way of keeping a car on the road. All they were just wooden posts, eye bolts through them, and then a cable, high-strength tension cable running through the eye bolts. That's made with wood dowels, little lifting eyes, which you get from Precision Scale, and then braided cable you get from a jewelry store. In fact, I spent a lot of time in jewelry stores and in craft stores trying to get everything I need for the layout. The hairpin fence you see, that is a casting that's available. You have to build it yourself, solder it yourself, but it's fairly easy. That ran throughout the Pennsy and only the Pennsy. So if you're going to make the Pennsylvania Railroad, you've got to put that in there. Another thing you see here is the catenary. This is the overhead wires that ran the locomotives. If you're sharp-eyed enough, you notice my catenary isn't in yet, but the poles are in yet. And the poles are pretty realistic. They will be detailed a little bit more As soon as I do the scenery behind the poles, I'll add the catenary wire. I have made sections of catenary wire, and it looks pretty good, but it's a lot of work. So sometime when I plan to be housebound for a while, I'll put all that catenary in. Another thing I do are the roads. The roads are made out of Durham's water putty. I put down a layer of styrene, then a layer of Durham's water putty, which basically mixes water and dries very, very hard. I dye the water putty ahead of time to give it a gray color. The beauty of this is you can flex the road a little bit after you've done it, and the Durham's water putty will crack. And the cracks will look really realistic, primarily because they are cracks. They also, you can get a pothole occasionally, and as somebody who used to commute in the Washington, D.C. area, I can tell you those potholes are pretty realistic. Another area I don't claim to be an expert on, but what I really wanted to get right are trees. New Jersey has a lot of trees, and they're not going up mountainsides. They're in flat, swamp, or plain areas. My trees are made by getting armatures from a number of sources, either commercially available, real trees outside, even those ceramic village trees, and then using super sage, which is a plant. You can get it from Scenic Express, and then commercially available leaves. It takes about 25-30 minutes to build a tree. The beauty is there is no wrong way to make a tree because Mother Nature makes every variation on a tree that you could imagine. Finally, another feature on my layout is the clock tower. The real purpose of that clock tower is to hide a lolly column. But if you're going to hide a lolly column, you have a tower. If you're going to have a tower, you put a clock in it. If you're going to put a clock in it, you should have 3 clocks in it, just like real life. And you're going to have clocks, they should work. And oh, by the way, they should illuminate. So what I did was I got cheap alarm clocks from Walmart, $2 a piece. I got electroluminescent panels from Miller Engineering, and the clock face was a photograph I made, actually designed from the clock from Back to the Future. And if you look on my layout, behind the clock tower, you'll see the DeLorean.
John, you've packed a whole lot of detail into what appears to be a very modest space. Exactly how large is your layout?
My layout is 31 by 21 feet. It's got an L shape, but that's the basic shape.
Your layout's at a very high degree of completion. How long has it been under construction?
Well, thanks for the high degree of completion statement. I wouldn't share that. I think I've got a long way to go. But anyway, to answer your question, I started in January 1st, 2006. I originally had a 3-rail layout down there. I started hanging out with a different crowd on Friday night, a bunch of 2-railer O-scalers, and I saw what could be done in 2-rail, so I made the decision to switch. I actually tore down my old layout and kept some of the stuff to convert, the locomotives and rolling stock, but most I sold, and I started all over again. When this house was built, I convinced the builder no rooms downstairs. There's a laundry room, concession to the fact that we have to have clean clothes, but the rest of it is a fairly wide open basement, which I was going to put the train in. There are a couple of construction challenges. You could probably tell from the video that there's a couple of lolly columns that the builder thoughtlessly provided to hold the house up. They got in the way. Also, there's a huge air conditioning duct that runs along the ceiling that makes for a place that's difficult to light. But nevertheless, I was able to work through it and get something that's pretty respectable. The benchwork is a modified L girder construction, which was pioneered by Lynn Westcott. Well, I say modified because I have really long beams. I used poplar wood, doubled up their thickness so I could have very, very long spans. The objective was I didn't want to have it, and wanted to minimize the number of legs under the table. The other thing is, because I'm doing the northeast quarter with a 4-track main line in places and 2-track everywhere, something had to go out the window, and in my case, went out the window was operations. There's no switching on my layout or anything like that. You just basically, a train comes from a hidden staging track, does a couple of laps, goes back inside, then I bring another one out. Sometimes I can run 2 trains at once, sometimes I run 3 trains at once. Put another way, view myself as a rail fan by the side of my own railroad, liking to watch trains go by. Some people would say it's a glorified Christmas tree layout, but nevertheless, I like it, and it's the way I enjoy it. Atlas FlexTrack. Throughout, I used Atlas turnouts. I gotta admit that the availability of Atlas 2-rail track is what made it easier for me to switch to 2-rail. Without that, I probably wouldn't have done it. It's not that I couldn't lay handrail track, it's just that, my lifetime is finite, and that's a skill I didn't particularly want to learn. Using their switches, using their track made it a whole lot easier. The control system. I think I'm rather unique in this because I use the DCS system available by MTH. It originally was developed for the 3-rail market. Now you can get it for HO as well. It's a proprietary system, which means that you've got to always use their system. You have to use their sound files. But fortunately, they have a lot of sound files. I get it for any locomotive I want. With the modern version of DCS, called PS3 for Protosound 3, it is also compatible with DCC. So if one wants, one can run a locomotive on their DCC layout.
Did you have any DCS locomotives held over from your 3-rail days?
I had 2 left over from my 3-rail days. Since that time, I have bought other locomotives. One of the things that I do a lot of is converting locomotives from 3-rail to 2-rail and converting cars from 3-rail to 2-rail. I don't particularly set out to buy one or the other. I don't particularly set out to buy a particular brand. I have no loyalty. I'm agnostic. Whoever makes the best scale model for what I want, that's what I get. But a lot of times in modern 3-rail locomotives and rolling stock, they are very highly detailed, full-scale size, and so for me, it's just not that big a deal to switch them over. If it's the case the rolling stock, the easiest thing you can do is you can just get replacement trucks to replace the existing ones and then put KD couplers on it. If you want, you can just change the wheel sets. Sometimes when cars are available in 3-rail and 2-rail, I pick the 3-rail car because quite honestly, I can sell the 3-rail truck and coupler for a profit compared to what it's going to cost me to buy the 2-rail trucks and coupler. And also I get exactly what I want that way. Locomotives are a little more of a challenge. Generally, the wheels have to be changed and have to be insulated. That I have professionally done. Doesn't cost me very much to do it. I do all the pickups and the wipers and things like that. But one of the advantages of picking 2-rail models, or 3-rail models, particularly if they're in plastic, is you can modify them and to your heart's content, and you can put a whole lot of detail in them that would make them surpass anything that's available elsewhere. I should also add that if you're getting into 2-rail, don't be put off by availability of products. A lot of stuff has been made over many, many years. You can find everything you want. Admittedly, you can't just go into your local hobby shop and buy it unless you're prepared to buy a 3-rail car, convert it to 2-rail. But anything you want, it's probably been made over the last 20, 30 years. You can find it on a swap meet. You can find it on eBay. You can find it when you start getting together with a bunch of guys and finding what they want to buy and swap and sell.
In fact, you've published a number of articles on converting unique pieces of 3-rail equipment to 2-rail. Can you explain how you go about converting 3-rail equipment?
The basic philosophy I follow is who's making the best model that meets my needs. I pretty much like scale stuff. I want it to be realistic. Now, as I said, there has been a lot of things being made, but some of them were never made in O scale, in which case, if they're made in 3-rail, I'll get them. A perfect example of that is the Aerotrain. I happen to think the Aerotrain is pretty cool. A little bit silly, but it's pretty cool. For those of you who don't know, it was designed by General Motors to try to show that they could have low-cost, high-speed rail transport in the mid-50s. The front end is basically designed after something that ran at Disneyland, but it's really just a normal GM switcher. And my favorite aspect of it is the coaches aren't really coaches at all, but they're simply GM intercity buses, which they widened and then put on a train chassis. Actually, inside is totally like a bus, and they even had one bathroom per coach. The men's room were in one set of cars, the women's in the other. Go figure. But anyway, as I said, it's a pretty cool looking thing, particularly because it's smaller in real life than the average train was, and the cars are really close coupled together. So it looks like one big long streamliner. MTH made the Aerotrain. They've made it over several years, and I figured out how to convert the locomotive to two-rail. I did the same thing with the cars. Now, this one, of all the conversions I've done, I don't mind telling you, this one was not quite for the faint of heart, because I had to redo bearings, I had to redo axles, I had to redo electrical pickups, and all that sort of stuff. So I wouldn't start with this one. There's a lot of other conversions I did that were a whole lot easier, but I think it's cool looking.
John, what would a simple three-rail conversion look like? Maybe, say, a piece of rolling stock.
Well, the simplest conversion to two-rail is you buy something that's two-rail already. But the bigger question is, how do you convert three-rail to two-rail? I look at it as you can do one of three levels in your conversion. Level one is the simplest one. You take a three-rail car, you unscrew the truck, the three-rail truck, and you screw in a two-rail truck. They're commercially available, and you add a set of KD couplers, at which point you're good to go. It's just not that hard. If you want, you can even do one step simpler, and you can just take the wheels out of the three-rail truck and replace the wheel sets with two-rail wheel sets, but I generally don't do that. Level two would be a little more involved. You want something that's a little more scale-like. First of all, you might lower the car a bit because a lot of three-rail cars sit a little bit too high on the track. Again, that's easy, just picking the right trucks or getting the right set of washers underneath. You might also want to add cut levers. That's the remote bar that operates the coupler. And you might want to add a couple other details. Again, that'll look pretty good. Level three is when you go all out. You look at a prototype photo in a book or a magazine or online, and you say, I want to duplicate that. That could get pretty involved. You might change the roof walk from plastic to wood. You might change the grab irons. That's the things you hold on to get upside the car. You might take them out and you might get cast grab irons and put that on. You might put end placards on. You might get carried away with underbody detail, brake rigging, air tanks, things of that nature. And before you know, you've got something that rivals anything that's out there in O-scale by anybody. But I wouldn't recommend starting that. I wouldn't recommend going whole hog. I would start with the level one conversion, simply replacing the trucks and couplers and let it roll around the track.
What have you done for structures on your layout?
Okay, about the structures on my layout. Most of my structures are either kit bashed and scratch built. There are plenty of structures out there that are available, but I want to kit bash them or scratch build them simply because I want to have something unique. Again, I don't want somebody looking at my layout and say, oh, that's the XYZ building from ABC company. I don't particularly care what the material is. I've got structures made out of hydrocal, structures made out of plastic, structures made out of wood. I'd use whichever is appropriate, whichever fits the particular building, its architectural style. You've probably noticed my city. One of the things I do in the city is the buildings that are further away are a smaller scale. So they're O scale up front, then they become S scale, HO scale, and even N scale in the background. The idea is I'm doing a time-honored technique called forcing the perspective. Or as I say, since I'm doing it in such a short distance, I am bludgeoning the perspective, trying to get it so the buildings look further away. If you notice in the night scene, the lights in the buildings in the background are dimmer than the ones in the foreground. Again, that's to give a sense of perspective. And I always mist over a light bluish gray coat of paint again, to mimic the fact that you should be looking through a rather lengthy path of atmosphere, which tends to, mute all the colors. Some of the buildings you see back there are kit-bashed. There's a New Lion Bank building that is made from 19 HO scale kits in order to get that look. I bet the manufacturer loved me when I bought all of those. Some of the buildings, if you look closely, are simply drawn in Microsoft PowerPoint. They're stand-ins, and eventually someday I'm going to put a real building there. Finally, I resist the temptation of putting the structures all the way up against the wall. First of all, I want to avoid shadows on the wall. Second of all, there needs to be sky you can clearly see behind the building. And of course, I light that sky back there to help add to the effect of distance.
Well, John, that was really great. Thanks for showcasing your layout. In suburban Maryland, Western Maryland modeler Wes Morgenstern has built and finished his dream layout. While he originally intended to fill his basement with O-scale trains, practicality dictated that he scale back his ambition. Nonetheless, Wes runs the largest Western Maryland steam, the 4664 Challenger, on very modest curves. In fact, look for the boiler swing in a couple of the video clips. Wes also runs operating sessions that provide a few hours of challenge for a two-man crew. Let's listen as Wes describes his layout and its operation. Hi, Wes. Thank you for inviting us to see your layout. Can you tell us what the theme of your layout is?
Oh, you're most welcome. The layout is based on the east subdivision of the former Western Maryland Railway as it existed between 1952 and 1954, when both steam and diesel were in use. The east subdivision ran between Baltimore and Hagerstown, Maryland. Both Baltimore and Hagerstown are staging areas on the layout, with only the towns of Westminster, Union Bridge, and Thurmont actually represented. Those three towns offered the most operational opportunities, with the primary focus on Union Bridge, where there was and still is a large Portland cement plant, as well as the company's passenger car shops.
Wes, your layout is almost fully scenic and completed. How long has it been under construction?
We moved into the house in 2000. The basement was unfinished at that time, so it took a couple of years for me to finish the basement and to build several rooms and a bathroom down here. The actual construction of the layout didn't start till 2002. I was anxious to get started on that because I wanted to have an operational layout, to have trains running by the 2004 National O-Scale Convention, which our round robin group here in Washington sponsored. The basement is actually 50 feet long. While I'd often dreamed of a big layout, like a 50-foot by 25-foot layout, reality kind of set in. I realized that at 67 years old, I was never going to be able to finish a layout that big. So I opted for half the basement at a 32-foot long, roughly, layout room, with a layout being about 32 feet by 26 feet in dimension. I decided to stick with a single deck layout. The low point of that layout is about 30 inches where the staging is beneath Union Bridge, and the high point's about 60 inches in the middle of the mountains. While I had hoped to avoid duck unders, we were informed by the city building inspectors that we had to maintain a pathway to the emergency exit in the back of the basement. This kind of killed my plans for avoiding duck unders, so I had to end up having one duck under that you can actually duck under, it's fixed, and the other which we have to raise up to get through to the inside of the layout. The layout goes both up and down quite a bit. The only level place actually is in Union Bridge. The maximum grade is about 1.8%, and the minimum grade is about 1.2%, 1.3%, something like that. Most of the track work is laid on homobed, road bed, and I used a lot of old Atlas flex track that I had from the previous layout. When that ran out, then I was able to use some of the new FlexTrack, which actually is much better. The turnouts are either hand-thrown or machine-thrown, depending on distance from the edge of the layout. And they vary from Atlas pre-built turnouts to ones that I hand-built by myself. The control system is a NCE 10 amp DCC system, and all the steam locomotives are equipped with Tsunami decoders, and I'll go into that later a little bit more. And the diesels have a mixture of both Tsunami and QSI decoders. Most of the structures or the layout are from kits, some being laser wood kits, others being primarily plastic kits from Walthers. A couple of three of the buildings are scratch built. They offered quite a challenge. The station building and the office building in Union Bridge, for instance, has about 6,500 individually assembled roof tiles. It almost resulted in a divorce. My wife kept saying, "What are you doing down in the basement?"
Your steam locomotives have some of the best adjusted sound systems that I've ever heard. All the sounds are in perfect balance and the volume level is very true to scale. Can you say a word about your steam locos and the rest of the equipment on your layout?
I mentioned before that I use Tsunami decoders in my steam locomotives. They're actually intended for HO gauge, but I was able to remotor most of my locomotives with efficient motors that drew probably no more than 1 amp. As you can see from the videos, they seem to be able to handle some pretty heavy trains, and the sound closely emulates the sound of actual steam locomotives. When I installed my first Tsunami, it was very much an experimental process. I had to fool around with the CVs for a long time before I finally learned how to do it, and got it to the point where the exhaust sounds were very loud going upgrade and very quiet going downgrade. One feature that I wanted to avoid was to have these human sounds coming from the cab of the locomotive, like the crew talking to each other and things like that. That to me was a little on the silly side. The roster is primarily steam locomotives, but I do have some diesels. The steam are either imported from OMI or from car and locomotive shops. Additional 2 engines are custom built by Frank Miller. One of those is a Western Maryland K2 Pacific and the other an H7 Consolidation. Finally, just because I like to see a little smoke, I occasionally go back to my teenage tin plate roots, and I purchased an MTH USRA switcher that belches out smoke, but it's isolated in the cement plant only. It's not allowed out in the rest of the layout. The diesels are also brass. They are from different importers, probably 3 or 4 different importers. Some from Overland, some from Sunset, and some other ones from Oriental. Over the past 40 years, I've accumulated about 300 freight cars. Many are brass, varying all the way from the latest brass imports to some of those that were built and imported 1952 to 53. In addition, I've built at least 50 or 60 plastic intermountain boxcars and reefers, which are beautiful models when they're finished properly. The new plastic cars from Atlas, MTH, and even Lionel often have better detail than the older brass cars, and they're a lot cheaper. The variety of freight cars available today is so much better than it was a few years ago that it's a great time to be in O-Scale.
With a layout that's nearly complete, you run operating sessions, which is a little bit unusual. So what's the operating scheme and what's a typical operating session look like?
Okay, I was lucky enough to obtain some employee timetables for the periods through the early 50s and up through about 1960. From that, I determined that the Western Maryland ran what they called traveling switchers. It would be the same as a peddler freight or a local freight might be called, by other railroads. In the morning, they ran a traveling switcher from Hagerstown to Union Bridge, where they switched out the cement plant and other industries along the way. And then in the afternoon, they ran a traveling switcher from Baltimore to Union Bridge, and again returned to Baltimore. To simulate that operation, I developed a switch list form that combined both the switch list and the Form 19 that tells the switcher crews when to expect through freights and when they have to provide clearance. We use a 4-to-1 fast clock to keep track of time on the layout. A two-man crew leaves Hagerstown staging with his train in the morning, usually around 10 a.m. At Highfield, they may pick up empty cars from the Blue Ridge storage track and then proceed to Thurmont, where they usually have work at the feed mill. From Thurmont, they go to Union Bridge, where they will switch the cement plant, the shops, several other fertilizer dealers, a propane dealer, a freight house, a team track, so on and so forth. And that will usually take 2 to 3 hours on the fast clock. The crew then usually has to hold in the clear for through freights, sometimes as many as 2, but usually no more than 3. And then they return to Hagerstown, and again they may have to do some switching to Thurmont on the way back. The crew of the traveling switcher from Baltimore staging usually serves the H.L. Mills Fuel Company in Westminster on the way to Union Bridge. They also often serve the Potomac Edison Power Plant with coal. When they reach Union Bridge, they also have to serve the cement plant and several industries as required. On their return to Baltimore, they sometimes switch to Sherwood Distillery, freight house, or a lumber yard. Although there are 16 to 17 industries altogether, and that including the team tracks and the storage tracks, to provide enough variety for the crews to keep busy and not be too bored. To maintain some semblance of reality, we try not to switch all the industries during one operating session. It's just not realistic. The one exception is the cement plant, where it was common for the prototype to ship out a dozen or more freight cars each day.
Wes, thanks for showcasing your layout for us. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Now for something completely different. We divert from the ever-popular transition-era modeling to travel to Maryland to look at 19th century modeling in O-scale with NMRA Master Model Railroader and historian Andrew Dodge. Andrew models the Colorado Midland, and in Proto 48 no less, where the correct gauge and finer flanges of fine scale really make a difference. Let's listen to Andrew's narrative. Andrew, you have an absolutely fantastic layout. Can you tell us what the theme of your layout is?
My railroad is based on the prototype Colorado Midland that ran between Colorado Springs and Grand Junction, Colorado, between the early 1880s through 1918. I have specifically picked the second division, which is between Leadville, Colorado, and Basalt, which is the part of the railroad that goes over the Continental Divide, because I wanted to have a major helper division for the railroad and be able to depict what 19th century trains looked like hauling freight and full-class passenger trains. All the locomotives are, of course, steam, and the operational concept is to follow the rules of the prototype.
Most people would look at your layout and consider it a truly mammoth undertaking, yet it's relatively new. How long has this layout been under construction?
I actually began construction of the layout itself in January 2013, and I'm still doing some work on it. There were some preliminary actions taken before that, of course, with the design, but also had to build all my locomotives from scratch. All the cars are basically from scratch, and all the buildings are from scratch, which took some preliminary time. But the layout is taking about 3.5 years to build, and there is some issues of reusing some materials like the trees, the figures, because I'm still in the same basic scale and time frame and it sort of truncated the time it takes to build. All the track on the railroad is hand laid. There's about 30,000 spikes in the system. All the switches are electrically controlled and hand laid. All the ties, all the wood on the layout, I've cut myself for the specific parts of the layout. The control system on is NCE. I had originally gone DC when I first started running to make sure all of the issues and kinks were out of the locomotives before I would fry a decoder, but now that has been taken care of, and I've gone to DCC where I can actually run double headers and second sections as prototypically as possible. All the structures on the bridges, the approach sheds for the snow sheds, I've made all myself. They're all out of redwood and some pine. It's been a real fun building. The buildings, they're still under construction, but these are not mock-ups. What you're looking at in here are the core of the building made of plexiglass, and what I'm going to do is apply the siding, windows and doors and roof material on that material. That is the base of the building. So it's going to be a really short process to complete the structures, because as I said, all the hard work, the construction part, has already been finished.
This is not the first layout that's occupied this space. Can you describe the evolution of your model railroad?
Yes, I designed and built my own home back in 71, and I had a room dedicated for the model railroad. I was modeling an HO at the time and built a rather large layout in there. Had something in the order of about 40 different locomotives based on the Rio Grande both standard and narrow gauge. And I had become somewhat concerned about the quality of the operation in HO because of dirt issues, the small size of the locomotives, how well they picked up. And when I rebuilt the house in 1988, I put another room on the front of it and decided to go to ON3. Modelers had provided models of the Mason Bogie narrow gauge engines on the South Park Railroad, and decided to go for that. And before I started modeling that, I had pulled all the track up from my HO layout. The standard gauge was code 100 and the narrow gauge was code 70, which turned out to work perfectly for the ON3 because code 70 rail is about 35-pound wheel rate, which is what the South Park used. Likewise, for the Proto 48, my Midland layout, being standard gauge, it uses a heavier rail, and the code 100 rail is about 75-pound rail, which is the closest I could get to the 60-pound rail that they actually used. In the changing of the scales, I became very much enamored with the fact of the size, the mass of the ON3. I also found out when I was redesigning the layout from the ON3 to the one I have now, the Midland, I had tried to draw plans for HO and O scale, and I did not get a substantial jump in size and space with the HO. You still have aisles to deal with and peninsulas, and I would not gain very much in HO, and I was able to achieve everything I wanted to as far as modeling in the Proto 48. It was fairly easy. One of the things I wanted to go to the Proto 48 was the fact modeling mid-19th century railroads presents a little bit of a problem because if you're modeling, say, Civil War era and you're dealing with eight-wheelers, the size of the engines and the drivers are sort of skewed and not particularly apparent. And when you get past the 1920s with the more modern locomotives, the mass of the boiler and all the accoutrements also overpower the wider wheelbase. But in my era, that doesn't happen. The engines would display that wider drivers, and I decided I had no other choice but to retain the fidelity of the Colorado Midland locomotives built by Schenectady. To retain that, I had to go to Proto 48. It was fairly easy to do. It did not require any particular extra work. All my locomotives are scratch built from bar stock, sheet brass, and some castings. And it was just as easy to make it in Proto 48 as it would to make it in O scale. There are a number of things available in O-scale for 19th century railroading, buildings, cars, locomotives. But one of the things I chose in mine, I'm a historian by profession and avocation, and I wanted to have a three-dimensional historical representation of the Colorado Midland, and I wanted it as accurate as possible, and therefore required me to go to prototype modeling, which means either you build everything from scratch or you have to do massive rebuildings and kit bashing to achieve the level of fidelity of what the railroad actually had at the time you're modeling. One of the interesting things I had done with both the ON3 and the O gauge, my current railroad, is I have made trips to Colorado to collect soil specimens from the locations I model, and it does a lot to convey the actual colors and makeup of the area because the colors are correct. One of the things I like to do in both my railroads, the South Park and the Midland, is to have a what I call presentation. Is when you come into the room and look at it, I want you to feel like you're standing in Colorado and you're actually looking across the room and seeing the various mountain ranges and buildings that existed at the time these two railroads were in operation.
You've opted for 19th century modeling and you've scratch built a lot of your equipment. Would a modeler contemplating 19th century modeling in O-scale or P48 have to build almost everything?
I opted for 19th century railroading because that period has always interested me. And one of the advantages of that is that you have all of the mainline railroad operations you will see in the 20th century, but you'll see it in smaller equipment, smaller cars, smaller locomotives, shorter trains, which makes it more transferable into a layout setting. One of the things is that I do prototype railroading, but if you are a freelance or freelance prototype, there are a number of locomotives that are available, both the American class, 10-wheelers, consolidations. You have lots of kits. You can go from U.S. military stuff in the Civil War era up to the end of the century. LaBelle is a kit manufacturer. These are not shake-the-box kits, but they are very doable, easily put together, that are available and have a wide range of kits available to you. One of the things that I always want to do is stick to as much close as I can to the fidelity of the history and the railroad itself. And that is one of the things you can achieve with the Proto 48 that is sort of missing in the standard O scale. The scale is the same, but the standard railroad, the gauge of the rail is 5 foot instead of 4 foot 8.5. The treads of the wheels are also wider, which upon close examination sort of show, and the Proto 48 looks finer and more prototypical to what you want to achieve with your modeling. But there are cars available, both passenger and freight cars, to do this. If you're freelancing, all kinds of structures, you go to Scenic Express, Micromart, other companies. They have lots and lots of kits that are available. You might have to take a few signs off or change the signs because more things would be 20th century. But things are available, and lots of looking online. There are many sources. You go to historical group societies. There are lots of modeling groups out there that would be delighted to provide you information and direction on where things are. There are lots of suppliers that make parts and kits that are not particularly well known, but they're there, and with a little exploration on the internet, you will find a plethora of things available for you to get and have fun with that are not a huge challenge to build or require yours buying a machine shop or scratch building everything.
Your layout looks to be nearing a stage where all the landforms and basic scenery will be complete. What's in the future for your layout?
Well, the layout now, the scenery, as far as the landform itself, are complete. There are about 1,500 trees on the layout at least, and I have another 500, 600, 700, 800 trees to put on to complete that part of it. The structures, as I said, need to be finished, so I will be having to purchase a lot of siding, windows from Tichy or from Grant Line doors for them, paying to research those. I have several water tanks I have to build, and I have parts now to form the roof of one and do the sides where I can cast those and reproduce those without having to build each one individually. The major features on the layout, of course, are the layout, the operational part of it, and running trains. The little boy is still very much alive and well, and I like running trains around the layout sometimes, just turn it on, let it run, or if I have an open house, to turn it on and not rely on somebody to turn the train around every 15 minutes when it gets to the end of the railroad. I also have incorporated in this staging yards that I can run this as a full prototype railroad point to point. And I have locomotives to run first division and second division trains, although when I worked on the timetables, it looks like I'm going to have to build a couple more locomotives. So I have ordered some of the brass stock for that, and I will begin building those sometime in the near future. One other thing that I would like to include on the layout is I will like to build a snowplow, a rotary snowplow, built by Leslie in the 1880s, and that will be made of brass, and I'll make it operational. So that will take a few weeks to put that one together. One of the other nice things about the layout is the fact that this is the Transcontinental Railroad. This is an integral part of the Santa Fe system and later other railroads, and it would carry passenger Pullman cars from Chicago out to San Francisco to LA. And so I have some Pullman cars to build. I have my coaches and baggage cars built, but I have about five, 6 cars, Pullmans to build. And their particular one class that the Midland used, there were 8 compartment cars that had their own kitchen, which did not require vestibules. The vestibules were added so people can move from car to go to the dining car. And because I do not carry dining cars, kitchenettes were included in the Pullman cars. Also, I have a lot of different freight cars to include. There are cars from the Rock Island that will appear on the Midland. There is a Southern Railway gondola that has a picture of on the railroad. And most interestingly enough, there's a Seaboard Airline ventilator car shown on the line, which gives you an indication of the wide variety of traffic the railroad would include. Operationally, I wanted the layout to have helpers, and I have 4 locomotives dedicated to that service. And this will be a locomotive-centric operation, and I will also be including in the operations, the engineers will have a timer that will tell them when their water or coal are nearing exhaustion, and they will have to be resupplied, which will keep you a little more attuned to what a short space these engines will run. On the Midland, water tanks were every 15 miles, and coal trestles are about every 30 miles. And typically, the engines would have to be recoaled almost every station where the coal dock, and rewatered about every other one, depending on what the load is and how hard the grade is and how many cars they carry. And so I'll have that. Another operational scenario I would like to include is that I became aware of the issues of the locomotive's adhesion in snow, rain, mist. And I am thinking about including that in the operation, where periodically we'll have a scenario where there's a fog bank that's crossed the line at Hellgate, and therefore you'll be required to use twice the amount of sand from your locomotive that are normally there. So engineers will have to anticipate this and reload their sand domes.
Andrew, thanks for telling us about your layout. We're not going to disappoint those of you who want to see a large O-scale layout. Ed Rapay's Pennsylvania Railroad themed layout is located in Virginia. Ed is a longtime O-scale modeler, having transitioned over time from N to HO and finally to O-scale. Ed's 2,200 square foot penultimate layout is built in a custom designed basement and is up to the task of representing the horseshoe curve in the King of Scales. Set in the transition era year of 1952, the layout features a prototypically accurate mix of steam and diesel. Ed was kind enough to open his layout for a day's filming, and he provides in-depth commentary on its modeling and its construction. Ed, thank you for inviting us to your layout. Can you tell us what is the theme of your layout?
The railroad is set in central Pennsylvania, 1952. In fact, the summer of 1952, as that is the last year the T-1444s ran in revenue service. I model a stretch of the Pennsy Middle Division from Huntington, Pennsylvania to Altoona, and a stretch up the Horseshoe Curve from Altoona to Gallitzin on the Pittsburgh Division. I also have two branch lines on the model. The first and most interesting is the Tyrone and Clearfield coal branch. In the real world, it served over 60 coal mines. On mine, we have 4, but it generates a lot of revenue, traffic, and interest. It can be operated independently of the main line. Sometimes when I'm home alone, I'll just run the branch line. Other times, we run the middle division, almost like a rail fan event. I also have a little segment of the Huntington and Broadtop Mountain. It was a small branch line from Huntington to Bedford, and twice a day, every day, 2 milk cars were exchanged with the Pennsy that went on to Harrisburg and further to Philly. It adds interest to the passenger train operations. I have main line running, branch line running, and a helper district. Depending on how many crew members we have, we can go up to maybe 10 to 12 operators. Sometimes it's just 2 of us. Either way, it offers a lot of fun and enjoyment.
This is one of the largest layouts that I've ever seen. How long has it been under construction?
In 2005, I retired from the D.C. area, and we had a house custom built down in Williamsburg. First 2 years, I did honeydew things around the house and designed the layout using AutoCAD. Third Planet was the actual software product. It took me about 4 months to design the layout. We did a lot of iterative design, trading off aisle width to minimum radius and gradients. We have, in the basement, I have approximately 2,200 square feet allocated to the railroad. It's an open bench construction with curved edges. I tried to avoid dead ends, and we do walk around control using DCC. The track is FlexTrack, commercially available from Atlas for the code 148. I used old Pullman or Micro Engineering 125 for the branch line, and a little code 100 micro engineering for some sidings. The turnouts were hand-laid using components castings from right away. In some cases, for curved turnouts, I learned how to make my own, but I found it was mostly for reasons of economy. With 120 turnouts, I didn't want to go out and buy commercial ones, and I found I could lay them within as little as 4 hours a turnout. The structures on the railroad are a combination of commercial kits, scratch-built, and more recently, some ready-built available structures from Woodland Scenics. And with little weathering and customizing of signage, they blend well together for the era I'm modeling.
If I had to characterize you, I'd call you Mr. Pennsy. What have you done with the layout to duplicate the Pennsylvania Railroad?
Once I chose the region of Pennsylvania I wanted to model, went out and hiked around, checked out the areas, bought as many books about the area with photographs to try to capture the critical elements that convey what the Pennsy was about in the time frame I'm modeling. The middle division, one of the key elements are the many stone arch bridges over the Juniata River. And I did get to model one recently. It's got the characteristic Pennsy hairpin railings. It just speaks Pennsylvania. The other key element on the middle division that I've tried to incorporate is the interchange with the Tyrone and Clearfield branch and the Bald Eagle branch at Tyrone, Pennsylvania. And it was done in the form of a Y between the main line and the branch. And it comes in real handy for turning the power as well as it makes an interesting look. On the Pittsburgh division, the key element I wanted to capture was Horseshoe Curve. And my earlier railroad had a 3-track Horseshoe Curve the wrong way. In other words, it spiraled up and to the right. This time I had a big enough basement that I could go with a 4-track climb, 2.2%, and it climbs counterclockwise to the left. Other elements on the Horseshoe Curve, of course, is the classic gift shop that was at the base of the curve. First time I visited that when I was coming out of grad school, and I hunted around to find out what that gift shop looked like in 1952 and scratch-built a model so that it captures the elements of it. It was a little difficult because there were at least 3 versions of the gift shop, and it was tough finding a picture set exactly in the time frame I was modeling. Again, another element is the signage that relates to Horseshoe Curve. And as you first drive into Horseshoe Curve back in that day and age, one of the key signs was for probably the best Italian restaurant in the whole Altoona area, Ercolani's. And I was able to go out on the internet and make a copy of that sign and included it along the roadside up to the Horseshoe Curve and gift shop. At the top of the curve at the tunnels at Gallitzin. Mine are quite modified and downsized, but it does capture the element of you're cresting the Alleghenies and you're disappearing just before the westbound to Pittsburgh descent. Pennsy modelers in O-scale are very fortunate in that virtually every major class of Pennsy steam and diesel power has been available over the last 30 to 40 years, and they're pretty darn good models. They capture the look of the Pennsy, and they run very well right out of the box. I do add details to try to capture the look of a specific locomotive, changing gloss wax castings and things like that to match photographic evidence. The cars and freight cars and passenger equipment, we have a real good selection for the transition steam era available in O. Some of it was kit built, some of it's brass, but a lot of my, for example, my refrigerator rolling stock is rather low-cost Intermountain kits for the Pacific Fruit Express reefers. And recently, Atlas has come out with quad hoppers. And I needed a lot of hoppers on the railroad, couldn't afford all brass ones. I needed 90 hoppers to round out the roster. Atlas came in just in time with the Pennsy H21 quads I can use on the branch line. I also have some Lionel conversions. Recently, three-rail Lionel has been introducing scale details, and I have a number of reefers, gondolas, and tank cars from Lionel mixed in with rather high-end brass.
Ed, this isn't your first time to the rodeo. You've been in O-scale for some years. You've also had previous large O-scale layouts. Tell us what you've learned along the way.
Of course, I didn't start out in O-scale. In fact, my first railroad was N-scale in a spare bedroom when I was in grad school. I was an H.O. Pennsy modeler for several years, and then in 1971, I ran across an article in Model Railroader by John Armstrong about his O-scale layout. He lived in the D.C. area. I called him up, and he invited me over. Seeing O-scale up close and personal, which was rarely before, I saw it in hobby shops, but really never saw it running, hooked me. The mass, the sound, the feel of these trains. H.O. is beautifully detailed, but O-scale's just got this weight and mass, and it's not delicate. As the prototype. This current layout is the fourth in a series of O-scale layouts. The first one was very simple, 3 times around loop, where I could just learn how to lay track, get my early kit building locomotives and freight cars running. And as soon as I had the opportunity to get a slightly larger basement, I started with a completely new track plan. But again, centered on a Pennsylvania theme. The ideas I incorporated in this layout are a culmination of all the lessons learned over the earlier 3, and especially of being around some pretty sharp people like John Armstrong, Ted Stepik, and even some of the young guys like Chris Smith and John Sethian. Each time I run across or visit a layout, I come away with takeaway points that I hope to incorporate in mine. Probably the biggest takeaway from my earlier layouts was that we have a lot of friends in the area that are in O-scale. In fact, we have a lot of HO gauge guys that join in with us on operating nights. And I ran into a problem between operators and viewers. We had a lot of rail fans, and we also had operators walking in the aisles. And the earlier aisles were just too tight to support both. So when I designed this layout, in fact, when I designed the basement, I made sure it was wide enough that I could have at least a 3-foot aisle width, in many places 4 foot. It makes it a lot more comfortable. The other lesson learned here is you're going to spend a lot of time under the bench work. And in this particular layout room, I was able to carpet the floor using secondhand carpet from offices that were tossing them out. They were free, carpet tiles. But it really made it comfortable for both standing and also especially working under the railroad. I use open grid construction I'm not a fan of L-girder because I like to keep the underside clearance as high as possible. And my top of the plywood base is 47 inches, and the railroad climbs at one point to the overhead loops at Gallitzin to 7 foot 4 inches. So most guys can walk around the layout without ducking.
When you moved south from the Washington, D.C. area and left the O-scale group there, I'll bet you didn't expect to find other two-rail O-scalers nearby. Yet you found some right in this residential complex. Can you tell us about it?
When we moved to Williamsburg, we actually came down with one of the O-scalers from the Washington area, Jim Taverna, and he's building a Pensy-themed layout based on the Northern Central. But we were really fortunate that between Jim's house, about a half a mile from mine, and another was the president of NMRA, John Roberts. John was a C&O modeler and particularly creative. So in a span of about a mile, we had 3 two-rail O-scalers in a golf course gated community. Turns out we have a model railroad club in the group, in the area, with 54 members. There are 3 O-scalers, two-railers, about a dozen HO gauge guys, 5 or 6 N-scale guys, and a lot of Lionel folks. It turns out that we share a common interest. We love trains. And on work nights, we have Lionel guys, HO gauge guys, N guys, doing scenery work, building structures, painting backdrops. That's common to all the scales. And they enjoy coming over and working on the O-scale stuff. And I enjoy going over and working on their HO gauge stuff as well. So you're not alone if you're an O-scale. There's a large group. In the Middle Atlantic region, we're particularly active. We have swap meets at the Strasburg Fire Hall that we like to go to 3 times a year. And we do round-robin meets with the folks that we left back in D.C. And now they've moved to Saturday afternoons where they actually grill hamburgers and run trains. So O-scale, although it's not to be seen often in hobby shops, is out there, and particularly probably the best place to go see it is to one of these yard sale shows like at the Strasburg Fire Hall. It's unbelievable how much O-scale equipment's been produced over the years, and because it's well built, it stands up to that period of time and affords us reasonable equipment and good operation.
Your layout looks to be nearing a stage where all of the landforms and basic scenery will be complete. What's in the future?
First off, the layout will never be complete. It's not my objective. It's the journey, not the destination. And I try to vary with the things I work on, detailing brass locomotives or building a wood structure kit. It adds interest. Right now, the focus has been on getting all the ground covered up so that visitors don't see bare bench work. At this point, the focus, my highest priority focus, is to complete the town scenes. Once a year, we have an open house for the neighborhood. We've pulled in as many as 200 folks on a Sunday afternoon. And the first thing when they walk in, they like to see the people, the buildings, the structures, especially the things that convey the sense of the time frame, like the Burma Shave signs along the roadway or the mail pouch tobacco barn on the hill. And so those are the kinds of things I focus on because the non-model railroaders that visit look for that and then seem to enjoy that. Coal mines are a major feature on the branch line, and at this point I have 1 model completed and 3 yet to build. Fortunately, there's some really great kits available from BTS for coal tipples, and in 2017, one of my priorities is to build a coal tipple for the coal mining community of Roberts, Pennsylvania. I should add that Roberts was named after John Roberts, the fellow I mentioned earlier, who's since passed away, and he helped influence me on how to do the company town related industry.
Ed, thanks for allowing us to see your layout.
Thanks, Terry, for coming by.
In Exurban, Maryland, Dave Vaughn has created a layout that most modelers could only dream about. Not content with his original 18-foot by 47-foot layout room, he expanded his basement twice to create an 18-foot by 90-foot layout space. In addition, Dave has conserved parts of the layouts of other O-scale modelers and incorporated them into his layout. Let's listen as Dave recounts why he chose preservation over new construction. Dave, I normally begin by asking the layout owners about the theme of his layout. Usually a model railroad is designed to represent a prototype railroad, a time period, or a location, or to fit your available space. However, in your case, the theme of the layout is intertwined with how your layout was put together. Can you elaborate?
I modeled a nickel plate road, and I model it as it was at the very end of steam operations in May of 1958. So all of the locomotives, rolling stock, and scenery, vehicles, and so on are all appropriate to that era. I like to watch trains run. I like to watch long trains run, and I wanted a layout that would enable me to not only run long trains and run them with the high speed that nickel plate was famous for, but I wanted to be able to watch the trains as we would see them as a rail fan walking or standing alongside the track. So a lot of my layout is almost at eye level, and I find that really a satisfying way to watch trains. I wanted to have continuous operation. I'm not a switching guru, and I wanted to be able to run trains continuously, both for my own enjoyment and for the enjoyment of people who visit the layout. So I needed basically a double track main with staging loops at each end, and I set out with the idea of building a layout that would give me that kind of operation. The second part of my layout, which sometimes is at odds with the first part, is that a number of good friends in the Washington, D.C. Round Robin O-Scale Club passed on or moved, and their layouts became available. Most layouts, even very well-built layouts, wind up in the dumpsters after a modeler passes on or retires or downsizes. And I really felt that a number of the layouts in the Washington group merited being preserved. John Armstrong's layout is obviously the most famous, since it was not only built by the father of model railroad track planning, but also because he used that as a test bed for a lot of his ideas and wrote and photographed the layout extensively while he was writing his books and educating the hobby on the advantages of track planning for realistic operation. So I decided to try and rescue layouts, starting with the John Armstrong designed layout that Ted Stepek built. And after Ted passed away, I obtained the layout from his estate and moved it into my basement. His layout was designed for an almost square room. My available room in our house was longer and narrower, so I had to reconfigure the layout to make it fit. Subsequent to getting Ted's layout, two other layouts became available: Ed Rapé's Penzie layout, which was featured in MR, and later John Armstrong's own layout, which became available after he passed away. I was able to take those layouts, and by cutting them up into sections using photocopies of the published track plans, was able to piece together a layout which not only preserved much of the best features of those famous layouts, but also then provided me with the double track main and long run time that I was looking for. The legacy layouts that I incorporated into mine were not only built to very high standards with hand-laid track, easemented and super elevated curves, flowing track work, but they were also famous in their own right, and they are a tribute to the friends who built them. I think they deserve to be preserved for their own sake and because the newer generation of modelers really deserve to see these famous layouts in the present, and I've been happy to provide that opportunity. There are obvious disadvantages in trying to save, let alone combine, legacy layouts. One is that these layouts were built in different eras to different standards and have been difficult to integrate into a single layout with reliable running. They also were old layouts, and they got banged up, and they required a lot of integration and a lot of renovation in order to make them fit together. And finally, when you're using curves, when you're using pieces of layouts and you're piecing them together, you can't really get quite the efficiencies of space utilization that you would expect if you started from scratch. But these were my friends, these were people whose layouts are famous in their own right. Those were compromises I was willing to make.
How long has your layout been under construction?
Well, because my layout includes components from other earlier layouts, I guess I could say that the construction on the layout started in 1950. John Armstrong's layout is the oldest of the three major components that I have, and he started his as soon as he and his wife moved into their then brand new bungalow in Silver Spring. In terms of my own construction, that is the integration of these different pieces, I started not too long after we moved into our house in 1999. So it's been under construction about 16 years. As I indicated, I worked with photocopies of the published track plans, cut the layout pieces to reflect how I had disassembled the layouts, and then fit them into a mock-up of the space that I had available. The initial space was 18 feet by 47 feet in my basement, and I installed Ted Stepek's layout, which is featured in one of John Armstrong's book and was one of John's favorite layouts, into this 18 by 47 foot basement. And I vowed that if I liked it but found the space too constraining, I would build an addition onto the house, and that's what I ultimately ended up doing. There was a crawl space to the back of the existing basement that went 16 feet out to the end of the footprint of the house, and I had that dug out, which is actually more complicated than you would think, because when you dig out a crawl space, you have to figure out how to avoid having the house fall into the hole that you create. But I got a structural engineer, and we handled the project. In addition to that 16-foot crawl space, which was dug out to full height, I put a 25-foot extension onto the basement, so the entire layout remains 18 feet wide, but is now 90 feet long. And that was fortunate, because not only did I acquire Ed Rapé's layout, but I also ended up, and this was not something I knew at the outset, being able to get John Armstrong's layout with the strong help and support of John's family after John died. And I was able to shoehorn that layout into the larger space, the 90-foot long space, which I never would have been able to do if I had not expanded the layout, basically approximately doubling its size. The working with legacy layouts is difficult because many of the layouts were built over a period of time. This was long before anybody thought of modular layouts, and so they were built with different materials and not built to any standard form of bench work, not with any standard form of roadbed. And obviously each of the layouts used different track materials, used different bench work, and generally required a lot of adaptation. I think it was worth the effort, but it was not as easy as it might have been. All of the layout, with the exception of some of Ed Rapé's earlier work, is steel. I'm a big fan of steel rail, and in fact the Armstrong layout and the Stepek layout used for mainline track code 172 steel rail. And I suppose that's one of the things that gives O-Scale the blacksmith legacy that many people associate with it. But the eye adapts visually very nicely to the code 172. And I just really enjoy the feel and the sound that trains make when they go over a crossing made of steel rail. It's quite a rewarding and prototypical sound. So I've enjoyed the older style construction. I really wouldn't trade it. It has been difficult to upgrade the system to use DCC as I do, because the Armstrong layout was originally built with outside third rail construction, so there was no electrical insulation or blocking in the track work. All of that had to be cut in, and the little niceties about DCC, like powered frogs and so on, had to be added. That was a challenging exercise, but I think it was ultimately successful.
In addition to the legacy railroads, you have some of John Armstrong's rolling stock and a train that commemorates famous O-scalers of years past. Why this paean to O-scale?
Well, O-scale is really the grandfather of scales in this country, and the people who built the hobby of model railroading were in many instances O-scalers. When I started out in the hobby, I thought that the hobby was about the equipment that you have and the excitement of getting new equipment and working on equipment and making it better. And there's an element of that in the hobby, no doubt. But what this hobby is really about is the friendships that you form, the relationships you have, and the experiences that you share over time. And I've been very fortunate to be acquainted with a number of the really accomplished modelers in the hobby, and I'm always looking for opportunities to incorporate equipment that they have into the layout as a tribute to them, as well as a recognition of the fact that these models are of very high quality and generally are unique to those modelers. So I have John Armstrong's passenger train. I'm happy to operate it on his layout. And I have known a number of other really, really great people. I have some equipment from Laurel Joyner, who many of you may remember from features on his layout that appeared in magazines. And I try and integrate the equipment that I have into the operation of the railroad. So I have a fictional passenger train that incorporates my nickel plate equipment, as well as John Armstrong's equipment, as well as Laurel Joyner's equipment. And this mythical passenger train runs from San Antonio all the way through to Buffalo. And I'm happy to include this mix as if it were a prototype passenger train operating over a number of different railroads. It has been a challenge to make the equipment work together. As I indicated, a lot of this equipment was built in different eras, built to different standards, and time has not always been kind to it. But the restoration has been well worth the effort, and I'm pleased not only to showcase the equipment that I have from well-known modelers. For example, I have John Armstrong's Super Allegheny, the 4666 that he designed and built. That's in the process of being converted to DCC and sound. But I also have the equipment of a lot of just good friends of mine. My friend Ted Leach built much of the equipment on my railroad and weathered it. He was a very accomplished modeler. He passed away, and I'm happy to showcase some of the work that he did. I also honor the work that many famous modelers did by having equipment from their railroads on my layout, even if I did not know them. So Frank Ellison's Delta Lines is represented. Gorian Defeated has a boxcar on the layout. There are a number of different railroads from friends of mine, and I think that's part of the overall enjoyment of the hobby and a neat way to memorialize the people that I have worked with.
Several times a year you host open houses for the Washington, D.C. area O-Scale group, and the layout is run extensively, so it's not a museum piece. But you don't operate in the sense of, for instance, the Operational Special Interest Group, the OPSIG. How would you characterize your operating interests?
Well, the operation of the layout is really a function of the mythical alphabet route that I run. I needed to harmonize my nickel plate interest with my deep interest in John Armstrong's Canandaigua Southern in particular. And I was fortunate to latch onto something that originated with real railroads and was adapted by John Armstrong himself. He captured what they called the alphabet route, which was a series of eastern railroads that worked together to try and expedite freight traffic. The nickel plate was one of those railroads. The Western Maryland and the Pittsburgh and West Virginia and a number of railroads basically coordinated their service. One of the railroads that was part of that alphabet route was John Armstrong's Canandaigua Southern, which ran from somewhere around Pittsburgh Junction up to Buffalo. It happened that my mythical part of the nickel plate is a line that runs from St. Louis on the west to Pittsburgh Junction on the east, where it very conveniently dovetails and interchanges with the Canandaigua Southern. So I'm able to run through the Armstrong layout under a theory that the nickel plate had trackage rights, and I'm able to run Canandaigua Southern locomotives. I have 5 of them from the original layout through on the nickel plate line. In terms of how I operate, I have to say that I like to watch trains run. A lot of the people who operate the layout like to watch trains run. And so what we tend to do is, as people arrive for the open house, they are assigned trains, and they simply run those trains around the layout. As I indicated, the basic track plan is a double track main with staging loops at each end. It takes approximately 35-40 minutes to go completely around the layout. And the dog bone that I described starts with the lower staging loops, which are approximately 28 inches off the floor, and twists and turns and is in multi levels up to the upper staging loops, which are at approximately 80 inches above the ground. They're actually suspended from the ceiling joists. And operating trains, and I regularly run 40, 50, 60 car trains, has quite a bit of train handling challenge, and I suppose at some level quite a bit of play value, and the people who operate it tend to enjoy those aspects of the layout. I hope that over time I'll do some more sophisticated scheduling of trains, and I do have a large amount of rolling stock and a large number of staging tracks, so I can operate a good number of different tracks on the layout.
Dave, what's in the future for your layout?
Well, the old saw is that no model railroad is ever completely finished, and that's certainly true for a layout that is as large as mine. I continue to work on the layout. Scenery has taken a back seat to a lot of other areas, and I hope to turn to that. I've been doing some additional scenery work now, and would hope to continue that. This is a very large layout. It has old components. It needs to be regularly maintained just to keep the level of operation that we have. But I would hope to increase the sophistication of operating sessions and increase the reliability of the track work and operations. It's a challenge, but it's well worth it, and I continue to enjoy hosting visitors. I've been very fortunate to have people come to the layout from all over the world, mostly to see John Armstrong's parts of it, but certainly they get an education on the nickel plate, they get an education on the legacy of O-scale and of the individual modelers that I've been fortunate enough to work with and fortunate enough to have parts of their layouts and some of their equipment.